Uh, Welcome to this session. This is the first YORhub hosted webinar of 2026, so we're very pleased to see that we've got a decent turnout and a decent number of participants in the room. So YORhub are very pleased to be hosting Amey today, and specifically Andrew, who is a lead and the lead senior ecologist at Amey, who will discuss today biodiversity net gain and its implications on construction schemes. So I'm going to hand over to Andrew in a moment. Just to briefly introduce myself for those who may not know me, I'm Gary Wright. I'm the Framework Programme Manager for the YORConsult framework, and I am also a Framework Manager for our YORBuild and YORCivils frameworks. So the session today is going to give you a greater awareness of the implications of biodiversity net gain and how to practically comply. It is a relatively high-level overview of BNG, and Andrew is going to cover topics that include what is biodiversity net gain, mandatory BNG requirements, benefits and challenges, a point on generating income around BNG, going to touch on some case studies, and there will be hopefully an opportunity at the end for Andrew to answer any questions that have been raised. If you would like to raise a question today, if you could put that in the chat, we'll use the chat function for questions. And then as we get to the end of the presentation delivered by Andrew, I will review those questions and we should hopefully have time to answer some of those. Couple of points to make you aware of. The session today is being recorded, and our intention is to make it available on our YouTube channel. So that's going to go on the YORhub YouTube channel shortly after the session's concluded today. If anybody would like a copy of the slides that will be presented, Amey have kindly offered to make those available. So depending on the number of requests and who would like a copy, we will find a way of sharing those. I am told it is quite a large presentation, but we will find a way of sharing that if it would be useful for participants. And lastly from me, before I hand over to Andrew, just to let you know that this is the first in a series of webinars that we intend to run throughout the year. So we're starting with this one on BNG. We've got forthcoming webinars on subjects that include mental health in the construction industry, NEC forms of contract, carbon reduction, and some other equally interesting topics. So watch out for those. Future webinars will be advertised on our website and through our other communication channels. So without further ado then, I will mute myself in a moment and hand over to Andrew, who will run through the rest of the session. Thank you very much.
Larry, thank you very much for the introduction. Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Pleased to be here to help do a knowledge share on biodiversity net gain and hopefully give a bit of an overview of what it is and help demystify it a little bit for those who may not be so familiar with BNG and what it means, particularly since mandatory biodiversity net gain has now been in place for about 2 years in England. So just a quick introduction. As Gary said, my name's Andrew Halcro-Johnston. I'm a lead senior ecologist. I've been with Amey for the last 11 years or so. I've been practicing as a professional ecologist in consultancy for the last 17 years. I am involved in all stages of ecological assessment and compliance for a range of different types of scheme, mainly working on infrastructure schemes for Amey as part of our sustainability team. So just a little bit about Amey before I get into the presentation, which is that we have a UK ecology team of over 25 ecologists spread across several offices across mainly in England, but also we have offices up in Scotland as well and in Wales. Our national ecology lead is a lady called Melanie Roxburgh, and we also have an ecology technical director called Kaylee Fawcett, who is a BNG specialist. I was hoping Kaylee would be able to come on the call today, but unfortunately she was not able to. Yeah, we provide a range of services from environmental support for environmental assessments, including ecological impact assessment, habitat regulations assessment, support to EIA-led schemes, planning-led schemes, preliminary ecological appraisals. And we also undertake a range of different survey types, including UK habitat classification surveys that are needed to support biodiversity net gain, and habitat condition assessments that are also part of that, as well as providing capabilities right across the spectrum of protected species as well, from bats, dormice, great crested newts, otters, breeding birds, etc. So the usual services that an ecological consultancy would provide. So B&G, Biodiversity Net Gain, is something that we have been getting to grips with, I would say, over the last, well, several years really, on various framework projects for national highways, transport, Network Rail, other public bodies that we work with as clients. And the team has been upskilling. So this is it's been a learning curve for for us and for many ecologists and environmental managers working in the industry. But as my work is predominantly based in England and B&G is now a mandatory requirement, this is an area that's forming an ever increasing part of our workload, supporting clients on meeting their statutory requirements, particularly for projects that require planning permission. Why should we care about biodiversity? So ecosystems, as I mentioned, provide a flow of benefits to people and the economy known as ecosystem services. So there's two closely related terms here, which are ecosystem services and natural capital. And natural capital is essentially the world's stock of natural resources, such as soil, air, water, and living organisms, that provides goods and services essential for human survival, for society, and for the economy. Natural capital offers benefits to the economy, such as crop pollination and clean water. Ecosystem services is the flow of benefits from this natural capital. So as an example, peatland, blanket bog, is a natural capital asset that stores carbon as an ecosystem service, and it also regulates water runoff and helps alleviate flooding as another ecosystem service. Ecosystem services are broken down into four main types: provisioning, regulating, supporting, and cultural services. So, for example, I mentioned flood alleviation and regulation, that's under regulating services. So in the context of biodiversity, biodiversity enables these ecosystems that provide these services that are essential to people and society to be productive, to be resilient, and able to adapt. And therefore, it's important to care about biodiversity, not just from a altruistic point of view, but because essentially we live as part of a system on Earth and we rely on biodiversity. It's essential to humans and to the well-being of the planet. And this is being recognised now through, well, has been for a long time, but is being increasingly recognised through the planning and regulatory framework and through international conventions. So biodiversity is under threat. I'm sure that's no surprise to anyone. Some of the main threats that are, or these can be classified into 5 main threats, which are climate change, land use change, both on land and also freshwater and ocean use change as well. Use of resources or unsustainable use of resources, extraction of resources from the earth, pollution, and the spread of invasive species, invasive non-native and alien species. These are the 5 biggest pressures that are degrading natural capital. And as a species, we're very good at damaging the very systems that help keep us alive and healthy. So, what is biodiversity net gain? Simply put, biodiversity net gain means more biodiversity after we have finished than when we started. So we have moved from a framework of no net loss, essentially, particularly through the planning framework in the UK, moving from putting back what has been lost to make sure there's, in terms of development, there's no net loss of biodiversity, no net loss of species or area of habitats, for example, to a net gain. So and this has been provisioned through the Environment Act 2021 that requires development in England to result in more or better quality natural habitats than before. This follows government reviews, for example, the Lawton Review in 2010, Making Space for Nature, a review of England's wildlife sites. The key outcome of that review was that wildlife sites and the ecological network need to be bigger, better, and more joined up. And BNG helps meet that objective. So essentially, it's putting back 10% addition to biodiversity than at the start of a development. In real terms, 10% is actually about break even because it's not a perfect system. Aim of 20% BNG would be aspirational, would be ideal from an ecological point of view, but 10% is what is felt to be achievable through the planning framework. So this is driven by legislation. I mentioned the Environment Act 2021. So this made BNG of 10% mandatory for developments and small sites requiring planning permission under the Town and Country Planning Act. I should say this just covers England. There are emerging BNG frameworks in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but mandatory BNG using a statutory metric only applies to England currently. The Environment Act also provided for local nature recovery strategies and a strengthened statutory duty to conserve and enhance biodiversity. Nationally significant infrastructure projects, so large-scale schemes, like transport projects, large-scale power development projects, Sizewell, for example. These don't currently fall under BNG legislation, but they are expected to from May this year. Some exemptions to BNG include urgent crown developments, developments that are permitted development, and the high-speed rail transport networks at HS2, essentially. Some other relevant legislation here is the NERC Act 2006, Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act, Section 40 of which requires all public bodies to consider conservation and biodiversity enhancement in their activities, which promotes the integration of biodiversity across all sectors. The Wildlife and Countryside Act 1981, which is the primary piece of legislation across the UK that provides protection for native species and habitats, and the Conservation of Habitats and Species Regulations 2017, which transposes the European EU Habitats Directive into UK law. And this focuses on the conservation of natural habitats and species of European importance. And while BNG is mandated under the Environment Act, these other pieces of legislation are all relevant when undertaking ecological assessments for development schemes and interplay with BNG as well. So some of the key aspects of mandatory BNG are these 10 principles that are set out in guidance. It was published a few years ago now by IEMA, CIEEM, Chartered Institute of Ecology, and Syria provide provide a framework for developers to follow. So these, I've put them on the screen there, these principles. I won't read them all out, but this is just to give an idea of the sort of the framework guiding BNG. And excuse me, probably the most important principle, number one, is applying the mitigation hierarchy, which is an existing framework for ecological assessment, but it also applies to biodiversity net gain as well. So a core principle of achieving BNG is to follow the mitigation hierarchy of first avoiding and mitigating adverse impacts on biodiversity from the development before then compensating for any residual impacts, and then achieving BNG by enhancing and creating wildlife-rich habitats. So BNG overlaps with the enhancement part of the mitigation hierarchy, where you're looking at enhancement of the existing baseline to achieve your 10% above the existing baseline. And BNG very much focuses on habitats. The tool looks at existing habitats and how new habitats can be created and enhanced to compensate for any loss of or reduction in quality of existing habitats. So how does Biodiversity Net Gain work? BNG is part of an ecological assessment of a site, which includes a desktop study and fieldwork elements. So it requires a competent ecologist, preferably someone who has CIEEM membership. So that's the institute that I'm part of, Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management, or other evidence of experience, such as a competent botanist with FISC, evidence by FISC, which is the Field Identification Skills Certificate. Biodiversity Net Gain has thrown a challenge to ecologists, I would say, in terms of upskilling, because it is, as I mentioned, very habitats based, and to assess habitats effectively on the ground and accurately, you need to know what the key indicator plants are for those habitats. So it is, in a way, it's good for our industry in that it's leading to an upskilling of ecologists in terms of improving their botanical ID, which is an area that's probably been lacking a little bit in recent years, and is a known issue really within our profession. So BNG requires a full UK habitat survey and a condition assessment of those habitats, and runs alongside protected and priority species surveys that would be undertaken as part of a normal ecological impact assessment for a proposed development. I'm talking very much in the context of development here because BNG is mandatory for developments that require planning conditions, so that require planning permission. But BNG is also useful and can be applied to other projects such as maintenance schemes that don't require planning permission if there's an aspiration for an organisation, for example, from Highways England, to achieve an uplift in biodiversity across their managed soft estate on the highways network, which may well meet with or fit with key performance indicators for biodiversity. And then an arboricultural assessment is often undertaken as part of this as well, where we need to know about trees as individual features, particularly if we have things like veteran trees on site. So the desktop study will look at various different aspects, such as the location and the ecological context of the site, understanding its strategic significance. For example, is your site located near to wildlife corridors or within existing wildlife corridors identified through a local plan? It will look at statutory and non-statutory designated sites, such as sites of special scientific interest, local nature reserves, special areas of conservation, special protection areas, for example. Look at priority habitats, and importantly, irreplaceable habitats. Habitats that are deemed irreplaceable from BNG point of view, including ancient woodland, ancient vegetation trees, or in the uplands, blanket bog, as an example. We'll look at buffer zones. We'll also look at protected and priority species records, potential habitat for protected and priority species, and also whether there exists a local nature recovery strategy. So the example I've given here is South Yorkshire within our region, within the Yorkshire region, which is an emerging local nature recovery strategy. As I said, the requirement under the Environment Act for each region to produce an LNRS to identify how biodiversity can be protected and enhanced So it's about restoring and improving the natural environment for the benefit of people and nature in a bigger, better, and more joined up way, as recommended by the Lawton report. And this study will also look at constraints and opportunity. The map there is just an example from the emerging local nature recovery strategy for South Yorkshire, where communities were invited to give their views on specific areas within South Yorkshire, where they would like to see nature improvements or how they felt about their existing green spaces. So going a little bit more into the sort of the nuts and bolts of this, as I mentioned, BNG is habitat based. So the survey needs to provide an ecological baseline. And the BNG survey provides a detailed ecological assessment of the current habitat within a development site. So I'm going to talk more in the context of development now. A competence assessor, usually a site registered ecologist, measures the size, the condition, and the distinctiveness of existing features like ancient trees and other habitats, woodlands, grassland, ponds, hedgerows, watercourses. They then use the government statutory metric tool to calculate a site's baseline value in biodiversity units. And so biodiversity units are a proxy for the value of each habitat and its biodiversity value. So biodiversity units are used to describe relative biodiversity value, and the metric also, the statutory metric tool, which we'll come on to later, considers factors like habitat type, its richness, age, connectivity, and its rarity on a geographic scale. These all contribute to distinctiveness of habitat and how important it is. So a common and widespread low distinctive habitat, for example, would be modified grassland, what we used to call amenity grassland. So, intensely managed road verges or sports pitches, areas of public green space that are intensively managed. Whereas an ancient woodland would be a very high distinctiveness and an irreplaceable habitat that is rare, that is old, that is ecologically complex, and is very hard to replace. And so the metric weighs that much more highly than a simple and common and widespread habitat. So there are measures to prevent deliberate downgrading habitat values prior to submitting planning applications. So if a site is cleared, for example, before a BNG survey is commissioned, then the assessment would be done based on the site's value pre-clearance. Essentially, you'd have to do it from aerial photography, which is not ideal, but that's built in to make sure that sites aren't deliberately downgraded to smooth them through planning. So the YORhub I mentioned is the technique that we would use as surveyors, UK Habitat Classification version 2. And a condition assessment. So each habitat is mapped and is assessed with condition by a suitably qualified ecologist. Usually this would be someone with a FISC level 4 that shows they're a competent botanist. So habitat units are measured in hectares. Habitat units are one of the 3 broad types of measurement that we make. We classify, for the purposes of the metric, we have 3 modules, which are area-based, linear-based, and watercourse-based habitats. So area habitats are what you can see on the screen here. So for example, an arable field, a pond or woodland would be area-based habitats, an area of amenity grassland, an area of scrub. Anything that can form a polygon, essentially, when mapped. Would be an area units, and these are mapped in the field, and they have their condition assessed as well. Hedgerow units are linear based, and these are measured in kilometres. Yes, hedgerow features, as you can see on the screen here. So it's important to record hedgerows and record them accurately on site as well, because linear features are very important. They provide connectivity across the landscape and also provide important habitat protected species such as dormouse. and commuting and foraging bats. And then watercourse units, also measured in kilometres. Watercourse habitat condition is assessed using a particular survey technique called the Modular River Survey Morph or River Condition Assessment. And watercourse condition assessment needs to be undertaken by a surveyor who's been adequately trained, because it's quite involved. I'm currently doing this training myself, and there you need to look at geomorphical, like the shape of the river, its bank profile, the aquatic species it supports. There's a whole range of indicators you need to record to determine its condition. So if you have watercourses on site, your surveyor will need to have done the RCA training and undertake condition assessment using the river morph survey method. Net gains in watercourse habitats are required when a development project occurs within the riparian zone. So that includes the watercourse itself between the banks, but importantly, it also includes a 10-metre zone from the top of the banks as well. This is all counted as part of the riparian zone. It needs to be included. So this slide just shows an example of condition assessments that we use out in the field, the scoring system. So again, it just emphasises the importance of botanical skills and undertaking surveys at the right time of year. The follow set criteria. So on the left there, the condition sheet is for a low distinctive grassland habitat type. So this is for, as I mentioned, modified grassland, something like an intensely managed road verge. You look at things like the number of plant species it supports per metre squared, the sward height, whether there is, the cover of scrub, whether any invasive species present or damage to the habitat. So there's a detailed condition assessment to be done for each habitat type and for each linear feature and watercourse as well. As I mentioned, invasive non-native species are important in condition assessment because the presence of invasive plants like Japanese knotweed, Himalayan balsam, giant hogweed will impact on the condition of a habitat and can certainly degrade it if invasive plants are well established into a site. That condition assessment will lead to a scoring of good, moderate, or poor condition that then feed into the metric. So BNG, as I said, is part of building the ecological baseline. So on this example site, we might have a wildlife corridor nearby, and as identified by the local nature recovery strategy. We may well have ancient or veteran trees that form irreplaceable habitat. We have areas of woodland and scrub around the margins of the site, areas of grassland, neutral grassland meadow within the site, occasional ponds, hedgerows and ditches. We have some invasive non-native species on site, and then our species surveys, objective species surveys that we've done as part of our wider ecological impact assessment, our baseline data collection for our ecological impact assessment. We have the presence of great crested newts, reptiles, bats, and breeding birds on site. And this is all building up the baseline, as I mentioned. I also mentioned the mitigation hierarchy earlier, so it's very important to apply this. We need to still try and avoid impacts in the first place when undertaking development schemes. BNG isn't a way of allowing destruction of sites. We still, it's not the case that going and buying off-site credits would allow complete destruction of a site and essentially just paying to clear fell a site by buying credits elsewhere. We still need to go through the mitigation hierarchy, and this has been baked into the process to make sure that important habitats are retained wherever possible on a development site. So we still need to go through that process. The biodiversity gain hierarchy is a material consideration for LPAs when determining whether to approve a biodiversity gain plan as part of a planning submission. So developers must describe the application of the biodiversity gain hierarchy, and doing so at the planning stage follows good practice and adheres to government guidance as well. So you see that offsetting is the sort of the final stage of the mitigation hierarchy. Avoidance is the first port of call. And as ever, that's why it's important to engage ecologists early in the project, in the project lifecycle, and even more so with BNG, because biodiversity net gain isn't something that's easy to design in as an add-on, or certainly not as an afterthought late in the process. It's something that really does need to be considered from the outset, working with developers, with local authorities, with colleagues such as landscape design professionals, to look at how a scheme can be designed from the outset to integrate biodiversity into it. So, mentioning design, some of the considerations. Habitats to be created and enhanced will need suitable soils and environmental conditions, sufficient space to grow and establish, and resilience measures to buffer extreme weather events, as well as other considerations such as public use. And that last one is particularly important because we're not designing habitats or creating habitats in a vacuum. These are habitats that will need to be managed positively for 30 years post-development. So need to have confidence that any habitats that are going to be designed in or created are actually feasible and realistic and can be managed favourably, including considerations such as public use, recreational pressure, for example. Ecologists need support from landscape professionals and maintenance contractors, ideally, to agree on habitat creation enhancement that considers aftercare, long-term management and monitoring needs. Monitoring is an important part of this as well. Access and likely costs over 30 years. So it's a team effort, as always with designing habitats, even outside the remit of BNG. We're not just creating something on paper. We need to be able to show through the planning process that any habitats that will be created can be managed and maintained for a minimum of 30 years if we're doing any significant habitat enhancement on site. Temporary loss and restoration may count as permanent loss and recreation or recreation in the metric. So it's important to consider construction space required. So on a development scheme, we need to consider the entirety of our red line boundary, including any areas for temporary construction compounds, haul roads, materials, laydown, all that kind of stuff. These areas need to be considered if they're going to impact on habitats, even if it's only temporary impacts during the construction phase of the project. And where design changes occur, then any change can have a large effect on biodiversity units and the uplift under BNG. So changes in red line boundaries can have quite a big change, and that's again something to be aware of when costing in BNG support. It's very sensible to allow for several iterations as a project develops. Projects are inevitably an iterative process, and there will be changes to scheme design due to engineering, cost, and other factors. And these need to be reflected in any BNG calculations that are undertaken. So this is the metric tool. I'm not going to go into much detail. It is just an overview. But the statutory biodiversity metric tool, its accompanying user guide and the habitat condition assessments that I mentioned previously are all statutory instruments, and they must be followed. So the metric tool comprises 3 modules for the area-based habitats, linear-based habitats, and watercourse-based habitats. For each module, information on habitat type, area or length, condition, and its strategic significance are entered into the statutory metric, which then assigns biodiversity units as a proxy for the value of that habitat. Biodiversity units are a proxy of biodiversity value. This screenshot just shows an overview of the main menu of the tool, which shows the tabs. It's an Excel tool, and there's various tabs for area habitats, for hedgerows, linear features, and then for watercourses, which also include minor watercourses and ditches. So you enter your data separately for the three types. This just shows an example of a baseline habitat sheet that's been populated, and a habitat creation sheet that's been populated as well. And you'll see there in the column distinctiveness. This is something I've not really talked about, but distinctiveness measures a habitat's overall ecological value based on factors such as species richness, rarity, and geographical importance on a scale of very low to very high. So an ancient woodland, as I mentioned, irreplaceable habitat would be very high distinctiveness, whereas urban, the first row on the left-hand screenshot there, artificial unvegetated unsealed surface, that has very low distinctiveness. This is a common and widespread area habitat type. If you look at the right hand, the bottom right screenshot, this example has reed beds on the second row there as a habitat to be created, and that's a very high distinctiveness habitat. And the distinctiveness is assigned by the metric. It's built in. So when we populate the metric, we don't put that in. That's assigned by the metric. It's also reed beds are also of high strategic significance. If you look on the final column there, and strategic significance essentially describes whether the habitat, whether it's baseline habitat or habitat to be created or enhanced, falls within a plan, like a local strategy, and it's weighted more highly if it does. So in this case, reed beds are identified as a habitat type that are formally identified in the local strategy as being of benefit in that local area. So, for example, in South Yorkshire, the local nature recovery strategy may identify reed beds as a priority habitat they'd like to see created and managed for the benefit of biodiversity. Should go back one more. Something else to mention is that one of the nuts and bolts issues of the metric is that you need to satisfy trading rules when you're populating it. So, for example, the metric won't allow you to replace habitat of lower distinctiveness in order to achieve your 10% uplift. So trying to replace loss of neutral grassland, which would be a moderate distinctiveness habitat with modified grassland of low distinctiveness, will flag up the trading rules aren't satisfied, and you need to satisfy the trading rules in order to achieve your 10%, your minimum 10% net gain. Anything above 10% is beneficial, but the minimum requirement is 10%. So the metric is weighted to avoid loss of high distinctiveness habitats. Also important not to forget the species as well. Although the metric doesn't take account of protected species specifically, you still need to prove gains for them. We need to go through the legal process of attaining licenses, for example, mitigation licenses. A mitigation license may be needed if there's impact on, for example, European protected species like great crested newt. That's all part of the ecological impact assessment process. So what doesn't the metric cover? Well, the features highlighted in bold here. Irreplaceable habitat essentially sits outside of the metric, as it says on the tin. Irreplaceable habitat can't be replaced, not within a project timescale. So you wouldn't be able to compensate for loss of irreplaceable habitat using BNG. Now, it would still needs to be recorded and measured on site, but you wouldn't be able to achieve 10% if you have by trying to replace the irreplaceable habitat with sort of, for example, say native tree planting. Invasive non-native species aren't dealt with specifically by BNG, although they do factor into the condition assessment. In this case, Great Coastal newts may be dealt with under EPS license, as I mentioned previously. They may be dealt with under district level licensing and other regulatory mechanisms, essentially. However, BNG does overlap with provision of habitat for protected species. So, for example, you might be creating new hedgerows on the site to help achieve your 10% uplift, and that will help provide new foraging and commuting habitats for bats, as an example, or creating new scrub, short sward grassland habitats, species-rich grassland habitats for reptiles and breeding birds. Just touching on offsetting, because this is something that many people may have heard of but not fully understand. So we have our on-site units and our off-site units. So our on-site units are delivered within the development boundary of the scheme. They're delivered via habitat creation enhancement via landscaping and green infrastructure as part of the post-development restoration. Off-site units are delivered through new habitat creation or enhancement on land holdings or via habitat banks that are outside of the site. So these may be, in the case of a local authority, maybe other areas that are controlled by the local authority and can be enhanced to achieve your 10% uplift in BNG and to provide your units. You may be a requirement to go to a habitat bank. Organisations like the Environment Bank have been set up over recent years to provide a trading mechanism for buying off-site units, and essentially the developer in that case would buy units that then are used to enhance habitat elsewhere. So, for example, a local wildlife trust reserve may be enhanced using funds delivered through an offsetting scheme. If those options aren't available, then there is the option to purchase statutory credits directly from the government from DEFRA, only if units, this is the sort of the last resort, because it's only if units can't be provided on site or off site. These delivered through landscape scale strategic habitat creation, deliver nature-based solutions, but they're very expensive and they're designed that way deliberately to encourage the creation of habitat and achieving BNG on site, preferably, or off site, as the first port of call, going through the mitigation hierarchy that we talked about. Just getting on to the planning requirements then. That was a bit about the nitty-gritty of BNG and how it's undertaken. As I mentioned, all habitat creation enhancement and off-site BNG provision does need to be legally secured, and this is for a minimum 30-year duration, subject to an HMMP, Habitat Management Monitoring Plan. And this is a detailed plan that describes how the land will be managed over at least 30 years to create and enhance BNG habitats. Natural England has published a template for HMMPs. And this legal agreement, it starts the date that it is signed. And for off-site BNG, the 30-year maintenance period starts when the habitat enhancement work is completed. So it does vary a bit depending on whether it's on-site or off-site BNG. But an HMMP is a requirement for any what described as significant habitat enhancements or creation as part of the scheme. So for planning applications, good practice is submit the following planning application. So the metric needs to be submitted as a minimum, with accompanying drawings showing the pre-development habitat scenario and the post-development habitat creation, which will often be related to the landscape plan for a scheme. So it's very important to work with landscape design colleagues so that the landscape plan, post-development plan, includes any BNG habitat creation requirements or enhancement requirements. It tends to interact or overlap with a LEMP, a landscape and ecological management plan, if that's a planning requirement. Would normally submit an ECIA or biodiversity impact assessment report if there's protected sites or species that are also being subject to assessment as part of a scheme. And particularly if it's an EIA-led project, then an ecological impact assessment will just be part of that anyway. That would also be a statutory requirement for an EIA-led project. So there's again overlap between BNG and the existing framework for ecological assessment. A BNG design stage report clearly setting out the application of the hierarchy, describing any on-site significant enhancements. And if BNG provision is required, these should be modelled in the calculation with information on any initial discussions with off-site providers if there's if off-site provision is required. And then the other requirement is a biodiversity gain plan, and this is essentially a DEFRA form that needs to be provided in draft alongside the metric that sets out how it sets out the summary essentially of how the how BNG calculations have been arrived at, and draft biodiversity gain plans is submitted with the metric at planning, but then a formal final revised version needs to be submitted to the planning authority ahead of commencement of development. Excuse me. So after planning permission has been received, developers submit the final biodiversity gain plan to the local planning authority, and the LPA has 8 weeks to approve or refuse this. Although mandatory BNG is a post-consent requirement, demonstrating that proposed development can deliver the required 10% BNG is a material consideration during the planning process. So the distinction there is that the delivery of BNG obviously happens post-consent, but you need to be able to demonstrate with confidence to the LPA that that BNG can be delivered at the planning stage. So developers should submit sufficient information on BNG with a planning application that gives the LPA confidence that the BNG will be achieved if planning is granted. And under mandatory BNG, where a developer relies upon a significant increase in on-site habitat biodiversity value to meet mandatory BNG, these habitats will be secured usually for a planning condition, for example, a section 106, or perhaps a conservation covenant. And that will then set in stone that they'll be managed for this 30-year period after development is completed. So 2 years in since mandatory BNG came into play, this has created extra work for local planning authorities, and I'm sure any LPA ecologists on this call will agree with that. There's a lot of things that need to be checked, including has the biodiversity hierarchy been applied? Is there evidence of competent assessment in the baseline survey? Has it been done at the right time of year? Have habitats been identified properly, and has their condition been assessed properly? Has strategic significance been applied correctly? Have any irreplaceable habitats been included? Have trading rules been applied? And has significant on-site habitat enhancement or creation been covered under an HMMP? Is there proof that off-site habitat units can be secured? So these are examples of the sorts of things that need to be considered. And the last point, though, monitoring is also important. So monitoring needs to be undertaken over that HMMP period to provide confidence that any habitats that have been created and enhanced will be maintained, won't just be left to scrub over, for example, if it's a neutral grassland wildflower meadow. And then that would also need to set out adaptive management measures should monitoring indicate that the current prescription is failing. So some benefits of BNG: allows for more habitat to be retained through avoidance in the first place. Ecologists should be involved earlier in the design process. This BNG really encourages that because it reduces risk to projects later on and cost as well. Considers biodiversity on more of a strategic or landscape level, bigger, better, and more joined up. It's a consistent measure of habitat value and replacement, ratios of replacement, and it prevents trading down on high quality, high distinctiveness habitats. But there are also some challenges and some disadvantages. There's extra burden on LPA ecologists, or there has been. Hopefully this is bedding in a bit now, but it does require suitable expertise. Designs may be metric-led rather than what is best in the local context, and that is true of any tool that you use to try and represent the natural world. It does tend to reduce habitats to numbers in a spreadsheet, and you can arrive at the result that you want, but is that the best for what's actually required for that habitat in that local context and for biodiversity more generally? There's possible to overstate the condition and habitat types that you want to achieve using the metric. You need to be realistic. That's really important. I think that's a challenge for us as an ecologist, not assuming that we're going to create a good condition woodland within 30 years, which is a complex ecosystem that takes time to develop. It may be possible, but realistically, a moderate condition woodland is probably more feasible. It places large burden on smaller sites, and there have been issues with the small site metric, which I won't go into now, but it's not a metric that I'm very familiar with because the types of schemes that we work on generally are larger schemes, but it can definitely be harder to achieve 10% BNG on small sites that don't have a lot of room for ecological mitigation, and that would tend to push towards offsite, sourcing offsite units, and indeed the availability of offsite units for certain habitat types. It's possible to generate income through BNG, so creating richer and more diverse ecosystems can open new revenue streams. So for example, internal BNG credit market, selling units to offset current or future developments, or the external BNG credit market, selling units to external purchasers directly or via brokerage. So for example, the Environment Bank that I mentioned earlier, other providers as well that have been set up to manage this market. Value of biodiversity units does depend on local demand and the type of habitat created, and it can vary massively across the country, ranging from £15,000 to £50,000 per unit. Those figures may have changed actually since when the slide deck was first put together, but just to give a very high level example of the cost of units, it's not cheap. So again, it's important to implement BNG properly and with expertise from an early stage to avoid costly changes later on. There's also opportunities to fund biodiversity enhancements within public green space, so potential revenue stream for LPAs to cover the cost of biodiversity enhancement and management of public green space, including removal of invasive non-native species. Potential for maintenance savings, so reducing the frequency of mowing as an example to encourage wildflower-rich grasslands, and then bringing BNG credits to market. LPA land may be suitable for small-scale biodiversity off-site units, which are harder to purchase for habitat banks. And habitats such as riparian corridors along rivers and open mosaic habitat on previously developed land are especially valuable. I did have a couple of case studies, but I am aware of time, so I will just very quickly just give a quick overview. One is an example of a project we worked on in Scotland, so it's not a this isn't mandatory BNG, but this is a highways depot that Amey occupies up in Glasgow, and highways maintenance next to the M8 in Pormady in Glasgow. And on behalf of Transport Scotland, our client there, we undertook a study to look at how we could enhance the depot for biodiversity. So we did an internal study, we did a site survey, and just on a small scale scheme like this, we looked at where they had areas of the site, particularly around the margins, that were kind of neglected, not being used, and how they could be managed for the benefit of biodiversity. And we put this through the statutory, well, through the metric calculator, and able to demonstrate that we could achieve a 44% uplift in biodiversity units for habitats on site, because we don't have hedgerows, we don't have watercourses on this particular site. And that's through sympathetic management. So, for example, removing invasive Cotoneaster and other species from a grassland mound at the back of the site, and scarifying and then reseeding that grassland to encourage development of wildflower meadow on a currently fairly boring, improved grassland dominated by full soap grass and other hardy species of grass. And then just some other enhancement, like managing the reed bed in a suds pond at the front of the depot, to remove some of the reeds, put in some marginal planting of native aquatics, putting up bird boxes and planters and other things as well that don't directly contribute to the metric score, but are all part of the enhancement scheme. And then the second example is Carrington Relief Road, which is a planning application we've just put in on behalf of Trafford Council over in Greater Manchester. And this is a new road scheme that crosses through a post-industrial area and crosses an area of farmland to provide congestion relief on the existing Carrington A6144, and it's part of wider development plan for housing growth in this area as well. And we undertook a detailed B&G study as part of the project. We've been doing surveys and baseline work on this site going back to 2021, so quite a few years, and the project has evolved in that time. As it's a planning application, we needed to do undertake mandatory B&G, populate the metric. So working with our colleagues, working with the client, we're able to secure that minimum 10% uplift within the red line boundary of the scheme. So the graphic on the left just shows an example of post-development habitats where we're creating other neutral grassland, so species-rich grassland on existing arable land, to help achieve our minimum 10% uplift, but also to provide areas for breeding bird, ground nesting bird mitigation for skylarks, putting in some scrub as well there to link up existing habitats and provide connectivity for bats and badgers and other mammals. And our metric results have actually led to quite a high uplift, particularly for hedgerows, because the landscape design involves planting hedgerows along both sides of the road over its 4-kilometre length. So that was that's quite a significant uplift. We're also able to maintain uplifts for areas, habitats, and for watercourses as well through riparian enhancements, and through measures such as woodland creation, scrub planting, and wildflower meadow creation as well. So that's the end of my presentation. Again, apologies if you've overrun. I won't read the slide out, you can see it yourself, but this is just a summary of what we've recorded of the presentation. And I think, yeah, just probably the key point I get across again is that do engage specialists early for B&G if you can see that it's a requirement, and the sooner that we can be involved in the process, the better the outcomes should be for the scheme in terms of being able to manage this new requirement, or 2-year-old requirement now in England, and achieve the uplift for the benefit of nature and for people as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. That's great. I appreciate we are over time. We have still a decent number of participants that have stuck around with us, which is appreciated. We have 6 questions within the Q&A. I think there are actually 5. I think the first question may have been submitted twice due to our technical difficulties. are you okay to stick around and attempt to answer a few of these now, time permitting?
Of course.
Okay, so I'll
Yeah.
read the questions to you, and if you can give us your view, please, Andrew. So, from Rich Smith, do you think soil biodiversity / health metrics are likely to be included in future iterations of BNG?
Sorry, soil.
So I'll read again. Do you think soil biodiversity / health metrics are likely to be included in future
Yeah.
iterations of BNG?
Thank you, Gary. And that's a really good question because soil is really important. The habitats that we record on a site are a function of the underlying soil and geology. And it's not something I really touched on, but understanding soil condition, hydrology, pH, all these things are very important for understanding, is it going to be possible to create desired habitats on a site? There's no point trying to create a species-rich meadow on a site that is full of nutrients, because all you're going to get is development of competitive grasses that outcompete everything else. In that case, you might need topsoil stripping. So it's quite possible that soil characteristics will be included in the future version of the metric, but I think that's going to take some work to get there if that were to happen. Necessarily, as I said, the tool is a simplification of nature, so it needs to be usable. And I think DEFRA have tried to, and Natural have tried to kind of not make it more complicated. There has been quite a lot of criticism of the metric, and particularly how it. One thing I didn't touch on is how it tends to undervalue invertebrates, for example. You know, it tends to simplify habitats, but doesn't really give the. It can undervalue the site's importance for invertebrate assemblages. Unless you have a specific habitat that's a priority habitat, like open mosaic habitat on previously developed land, then sites can be, particularly brownfield sites, can be undervalued for that. So the same with soil characteristics as well. So possibly, but I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. Is my honest answer on that one.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll go again with another question from Rich Smith. What are the typical costs of off-site units and statutory credits, or does this vary wildly?
Yeah, so I will be fully transparent. I don't have much experience of dealing with off-site units because the projects we worked on, we've always sought to achieve BNG within the site boundary. And the Carrington example I gave there was with one of those. There was the opportunity with that particular local authority, with Trafford, to look at off-site areas that they also manage. And we did discuss off-site units, but or purchasing of off-site biodiversity credits, but the preference was to deliver BNG within the site on that one. So units, the figures I gave there, an example, I think, sort of up to 50k, but it can certainly go above that, I think, for higher distinctiveness habitats, things like wetland habitats like fen, for example, or good quality woodland habitat. So I would need to go away and do a little bit of research into that. I haven't dealt a lot with environment banks, with habitat banks, but I think they do vary quite a lot, the costs, depending on the type of habitat you're seeking to purchase.
Okay, thank you very much. Got a question from an anonymous attendee. Does watercourse condition surveying, and in brackets PORPH assessment, take into account the water quality, i.e. pollution levels?
So yeah, so river morphological, river morph surveys, river condition assessment. You do look at various indicators. Sorry, excuse me. As part of the when you're looking at your watercourse survey units, so you do a number of river structures. You look at them and you record various factors, including the flow rate and the bank profile and all these things that I mentioned. And water quality I'm actually trying to cast my mind back now because it's a little while since I looked at this, but water quality is part of that. It does look at the it does look at the quality of the water. If there's obvious signs of pollution, for example, that would be factored into the condition score for that particular stretch of river for that MORPH survey.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another question from an anonymous attendee. As trying to complete a habitat survey from aerial photos, etc., is challenging, should there be a penalty for anyone who tries to downgrade a site by clearing it before a survey has been undertaken?
Yeah, and that's a really good point. I think there have been some examples of where that has happened, where less scrupulous developers have sought to clear a site ahead of bringing an ecologist to do the site survey to essentially downgrade its biodiversity value. Again, it's not a scenario I'm particularly familiar with. Luckily, we tend to deal with more reputable clients at Amey. Yes, there should be penalties for that. I think the way of stopping that happening, as I mentioned, is that if that's clearly been the case, and that's the local authority can see that's the case, the BNG, they will require the BNG assessment to be done on the habitat's the site's pre-clearance value. So essentially, you'd have to do it from aerial imagery and an approximation. In terms of like financial penalties and sanctions and fines, I'm not so clear on that. Obviously, there could be implications if the bat roost was cleared illegally, removed, all that kind of thing. So yeah, there are potential financial and legal ramifications of doing that. But from a purely BNG point of view, then the site value would be taken from the pre-clearance scenario.
Okay, thank you. We just have two questions left, I believe. One of them I feel may require a more substantial explanation. So we're gonna cover the question from Amey Barker first, if that's okay. And that is, what type of maintenance projects would BNG apply to?
What type of maintenance project? Okay. Well, we prior to mandatory biodiversity net gain coming in 2024, we were already undertaking biodiversity net gain assessments here at Amey for some of our bigger clients. So Highways England, as I mentioned, for example, on their soft estate, they have KPIs for improving biodiversity on the soft estate, but also on some framework contracts that we work on for maintenance, for road maintenance, where there's an impact on the soft estate, then we would still undertake BNG assessments to determine, as part of our standard ecological assessment, as part of our standard site walkover, to identify if there's any protected species constraints or any important habitats. We would undertake mapping of habitats and condition assessment and put that through previous versions of the metric. Network Rail, for example, had their own, prior to mandatory metric, they had their own versions of the metric, which we've used in the past to inform maintenance schemes. So there isn't, again, it's permitted development. There isn't the statutory requirement to do it, but there may be internal drivers to do it, including KPIs for biodiversity. So we would tend to do that. I'm not sure if that fully answers your question, but hopefully that gives an idea. But yeah,
Okay.
well, BNG can be done for planning led schemes as well. And we as an organisation, we have done that, and I'm sure other organisations do that as well.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. So the last question, I do apologise for leaving this one till last because it was the first question asked, but you might need to go away and come back to us on this one. I'm not sure. So could you explain the final results tab on the biodiversity metric Excel tool on the headline results page, which number is showing the BNG requirement of plus 10% as met? And in brackets, it says there are 3 under total net unit change habitat units, hedgerow units, and watercourse units. Do all three, as relevant, need to hit 10% improvement, or is it purely the habitat units percentage?
That's a really, sorry, who was that from, Gary?
That's from an anonymous participant, so I can't
okay.
share their name with you, I'm afraid.
That's a very, I will share my screen again if I may.
Of course, yep.
There we go. There, can you see that slide again?
Yep. It's a bit small. You might want to put it in present.
Yeah, I will open it again from current slide. There we go. There you go. So I think you're referring to this. This is just an extract that I've taken from the metric for this particular scheme, so it doesn't show all the detail. But yes, what that shows is that for each of the three modules, area, hedgerow, and watercourse, we've achieved a 10%. And a really important point that the person who asked the question made is that, do you need to achieve 10% across each? And yes, you do. So it's not a cumulative, and actually I realize I probably should have made this more explicit during the presentation, but it's not a cumulative 10%. So you can't achieve 10%, you know, say you achieve 50% uplift in area habitats, but you're still losing some hedgerow. That 50% uplift in area habitat won't compensate for the loss of hedgerow. You need to achieve your 10% across all three types, which again can be a challenge. Now, on a big scheme like this, it was a bit easier because we had more room to play with within our red line boundary. But if you had a small scale housing development, for example, where you're trying to, the developers wishing to put in as many units as possible, as many housing plots as possible, and there's loss of hedgerow, loss of area of woodland, loss of a watercourse, say a stream running through or diversion, then you would need to achieve that 10% uplift, not just no net loss, but that uplift across all those three areas, those three modules. And that then may lead to, if you can't do that on site, that may then require looking at off-site options such as purchasing units. So in this case, we did achieve the 10%. We were able to achieve above that as well. But that, that is quite a high uplift. I would suggest that's not typical, but that largely reflects the function of the landscape design on this scheme. We're able to put in a lot of hedgerow, for example, to try and maintain that landscape connectivity where the road is going through existing habitats. We want to try and restore that connectivity. So hopefully that answers that.
I think so, and I believe so. That's it. They are all the questions that were submitted using the Q&A function. From me to wrap up relatively quickly, thank you very much for giving up your time, Andrew, to be with us today, and for Amey generally for supporting us with our series of webinars and being the first of 2026. Apologies for the technical difficulties at the start, and thank you everybody for bearing with us. Thank you to all of those who attended. I think we had nearly 70 participants at one stage, so that's a great turnout for our first webinar. As mentioned at the start, we have a series of other webinars that we will be running through the year, so please watch out for those, and we hope that you can join us. Just to reiterate a couple of other points at the start, the recording will be going live on our YouTube channel at some point in the not too distant future. Anybody who would like a copy of the presentation slides, I've put my email address in the chat. You're welcome to email me with that request and I will pass it on. And similarly, in terms of questions, we answered all of those that were submitted during the Q&A. If you would like to ask a question separately or think of something afterwards, feel free to drop that through to me and I will liaise with Andrew to hopefully get you a response. So I think it's just to say thanks again, and we'll see you on the next one, hopefully.
Thanks very much.
Cheers.
Yeah. Thanks, Gary.
Bye-bye. Cheers.